video games and digital games are also heavily criticized for their extreme violence. Now, of course, not all video games include acts of violence. There are games like The Sims, for instance, that are not especially violent or aggressive. However, a lot of video games in certain genres like action adventure or first person shooter games are very violent with lots of very explicit scenes of brutal murders and killings, attacks, and physical forms of violence in a variety of pretty extreme ways, with the use of guns, rifles, knives, dismemberment. Some of this is pretty extreme stuff. So over the years, that's led to a lot of criticism of the violence in these games, in particular because video games are played by fairly young users, and some critics argue that these young players are very impressionable, very susceptible to influence from the images and ideas that they encounter in media. What are the possible effects or influences of watching violent video games? In the popular media and in some research, there's a pretty straightforward argument made that that watching lots of or playing lots of video games that have extreme forms of violence might lead to aggressive behavior. That as somebody spends more and more of their time playing these games that have brutal forms of attacks and killing and violence, that might encourage somebody to be aggressive or violent in their own daily life. And I think there are other possible influences that some have raised as well. One is the possible influence of desensitization. The idea that if you're constantly playing these games and seeing all of these extreme acts of violence, that may for the viewer encourage the viewer to lose a sense of outrage or a sense that this violence is somehow exceptional. The idea here is that if you're constantly watching violence or encountering it in these games, violence may come to be seen as a normal part of life, that the viewer doesn't see it as anything exceptional or unusual or out of the ordinary. The worry here is that people over time wind up accepting extreme violence in society as just part of life. I think another worry is that for young viewers, that if they're playing all these games where to win the game you have to be aggressive or violent, that it may teach young viewers, young male viewers in particular, that the best way to deal with conflict, the best way to resolve conflict, is through aggression and violence. If you get into an argument at school, well, you just beat up the other person and bludgeon them into submission. It encourages the video game player to immediately go to aggression and violence as a way to solve problems, rather than looking at other conflict resolution strategies like cooperation or trying to work out some kind of compromise with somebody that you have some conflict with, right? Now, all of these arguments about the potential influence of violence in video games can be applied to other forms of media, and frankly have been. That if you follow debates about violence in media, this is not confined to video games or digital games. That these same arguments are raised about violence on TV shows, or in action-adventure films, or in hip-hop or rap music, all right? I should also point out that not all of these arguments go unchallenged, right? That some argue that video violence in video games and other media, that they're used as a scapegoat for the problem of violence in society. That it's really easy to say, oh, you know, why do we have all this crime and violence in society? Well, it's the media. The media made people do it. Some argue that that's a really simplistic, you know, superficial explanation for why we have violence in society. That you know, that some argue that the problem of violence in society and why people act in aggressive ways is very complicated and due to many social factors like one's upbringing, family life, education, socioeconomic background, and so forth. But it's a question for us, which is, you know, does this, you know, explicit and gratuitous violence in video games contribute in any way to aggressive behavior by those that play video games? And it's a question that's become much more urgent in the aftermath of these, you know, continual horrific school shootings. I mean, after every one of these, you know, massive attacks where all these kids are gunned down in schools, the question is, well, what prompted this horrific activity? What prompted the shooter or the killer to you know, to commit all of these murders? And infrequently, people will ask questions about what role violent media content played in the socialization of the person that committed these heinous acts. Another recurring criticism of video games is misogyny or hatred of women. Here, some critics argue that in a lot of video games, women are treated in a very derogatory manner, that especially in a lot of shooter games and action-adventure games, women are really marginalized and usually only presented as sex objects, presented as prostitutes or people to pick up in bars and have sex with. And in a lot of these games with lots of violence, players get points for aggressively attacking women. Right? I guess in some of the games, you get points for having sex with a prostitute and then killing her afterwards. So real questions here about whether or not there's a systematic bias against women in video games. Are they sexually objectified? Are they rendered as really irrelevant to the plot of these games? And do games reward players for abusing women? Also, some really interesting questions here about why there are these anti-female themes in video games to begin with. Why are women presented in these demeaning ways? Well, some call attention to who's actually constructing these video games. And it is really striking how male-dominated the video game industry is. That the vast majority of people that produce and create successful video games are indeed males. So does this absence of female creative input affect the content of these games and lead to women being presented in this manner? Before I leave these topics, I think one could also ask broader questions about how these last two topics, the violence and the misogyny of some of these video games, how these are connected. And some scholars argue that if you look at video games, digital games, in a broader context, you could make an argument that a lot of these games tend to reinforce certain traditional ideas about gender more generally, all right? That the games tend to reinforce traditional ideas about masculinity and what it means to be male, that it involves being aggressive, dominant, forceful, and in charge, and in particular, dominating females, often in a sexual way. That the games also tend to reinforce very kind of retro conventional ideas about female gender, right? Presenting women as submissive, sexualized, only valuable in terms of their physical appearance and how they please males. So as we're talking about these criticisms of video games, I want you to think about how valid they are, how much they can be related to games that you're familiar with or you have played. Do you see these themes prevalent in video games that you're familiar with? And also think about whether or not game players might be affected in the ways that some of these critics suggest. In terms of violence, do you think it's so that a heavy video game player is desensitized to the problem of violence, winds up relying on conflict and aggression as a way to solve problems? Does it lead players to be more aggressive in their everyday life? And does it promote misogynistic, anti-female views?